Welcome to Untethered to Rooted, a podcast that brings you a collection of stories around grief, healing, and identity. Hear from everyday people how grief and loss shape their identity and how their identity shapes the way they heal and process grief. I'm your host, Dana Daugherty, a licensed psychotherapist with extensive experience dealing with grief, both personally and professionally. And if you want to hear stories with gems and practical tools for healing, stay tuned for more. Hello, welcome to Untethered to Rooted. Untethered to Rooted is an in-depth look at stories of grief and healing and how it shapes our identity. My name is Dana Daugherty, and I'm your host. I identify as a Black woman who's a licensed psychotherapist, and I have personally experienced grief, and I also professionally help clients who have experienced grief and provide opportunities and tools to clients for healing. This particular podcast is a collection of stories around grief and loss and how it intersects with our identities in ways that shape our healing and hopefully also ourselves. It's a podcast that amplifies stories from everyday people that you don't normally hear from. So it's about all of our unique experiences of grief and healing and how your particular identities shape your processing of your grief. And one thing I really wanted people to know with this podcast was I want people to hear stories of grief and also journeys to healing, but I also want this question asked and hopefully answered of what do you wish people knew from the people who've actually experienced this grief? And so that's what we'll dive into today for me. Okay, so my story around grief is really a story around the individual wrapped up with the collective grief that the nation was experiencing. I really kind of got into my own individual experience of grief in March 2020, which is a familiar month and date for everyone. It's when COVID began and when lockdowns and shutdowns began. I think around the world, that was just really a shift. It was certainly a shift in my own community. It was a shift in how I was doing business. And really, stories around grief started coming up a lot and loss, especially as people were losing jobs, people were losing their lives. And we didn't have a vaccine out there, and there was a lot of loss of hope. And just, it was a scary time at the beginning of the pandemic. And my grief was further accelerated in May 2020, especially with the public viewing of George Floyd's death. And stories continued to come out around not only George Floyd, but also Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain, and the list goes on of names and names. And it's sad. It was sad for especially myself, seeing myself as a person who cares a lot about the Black community, but also seeing people who look like me having their lives threatened. And a week later, my mom calls and she tells me that the doctor has found a tumor in her pancreas and that it was most likely not benign and that they would have to do some more further testing on it. And it was only sort of a week after that phone call, and then a couple weeks after that, that we learned that my mom had stage 1 pancreatic cancer. And that began my new immediate experience of anticipatory loss and grief, which was coupled with hypervigilance and tending to myself while also caring for clients and walking with them in their own individual journeys with grief that they were experiencing in a situation that we'd both never been involved in before, with the pandemic and death and mortality and all these questions and racial consciousness and reawakening and reckoning. But just everything was so heightened with polarization in the country and hypervigilance and just unknowns and caution. And so it really was a balance of putting my feelings aside sometimes when it came to tending my clients and then kind of like picking them back up as I was being more aware of my feelings outside of those sessions, and even during those sessions, to be actually a good clinician as well. But as soon as I found this out, I knew I needed support. And I was young. I didn't know many other people my age as a millennial who had this experience of losing their parents in this age. My mom was in her 60s, and so this was really a new experience for me, and honestly a newer experience for people in our generation age group. And so I leaned on support from other people. I had my own therapist, fortunately, who was more skilled in the areas I was not skilled in, to really help me both professionally and also personally. But socially, I really felt alone in my experience. And I also reached out knowing that people may hold this one time with me or a few times or even consistent with me through it. But I was especially grateful for people who held it with me consistently and kept checking back in. And I was especially grateful for people who were willing to inconvenience themselves to be a support. I had friends who flew across the country, gifted me items to comfort me. They didn't try to silver lining my grief by saying, like, look at the bright side or at least this or that. They just met me where I was at. And that was really comforting. And at the same time, I was also looking for just a way, just any information for what to do. I was like looking up on Google, what do you do if you lose your parents in your 30s? What do you do if you lose a parent in your 30s? And so I was really kind of searching for a lot of answers, and I found some websites that were great. There were several that were run by lots of different grief experts and had a lot of good information, but I didn't see anybody who looked like me who was like reflected in that experience. And so it was much harder to find other people who were like people of color who had lost a parent and also were navigating the racial trauma in society at that moment, and also were navigating just this collective grief and shedding of different things that we had learned and unlearning things while relearning things. It was just like a confluence of all of these different pieces of my life experience coming at this moment, and shedding of identities and really relearning new things and putting on new identities and realizing some identities were more important at this time, and especially my identity as definitely my identity as a therapist, but also my identity as a daughter, and really just paying more attention to that role in my life, I think, came up much more. I think I had been really focused on my career, and so that came up a lot. And so, yeah, I think as I was processing my grief and, being supportive of my mom, going through chemo treatments and radiation, and then miraculously, after 6 months, completing chemo treatment and feeling hopeful, I had this idea for this podcast January 2021. So my mom was still around in this like earthly setting. And I wanted people to really know how much grief changes you. I didn't want other people to feel what I felt, which was I felt really alone in my grief. And while I knew that everybody's experience with grief was unique, I just wasn't sure if anybody could really align or parallel with my own personal experience of just being in this situation of long-term illness. And at the same time, I was like, well, this isn't like an immediate death. It actually, because of this time and my mom not knowing about whether she would survive her treatments or not, it was just a constant sort of adjustment and readjustment of where are we at in our relationship, like my relationship with my mom. And I was like, where are we at in how I'm spending time with you? Where are we at in the things that like we always kind of wanted to do or fix, or different pieces of our relationship? Those were the things that we were starting to really begin to talk about, because it was just, these were the sort of conversations that were going to be really important in shaping me, who'd be like left here if the treatments didn't turn out well. I was realizing at that time that there was so much relief when my mom completed chemo December 2020. She had dodged COVID. She had not gotten COVID by some like miracle. And she had completed all of her chemo sessions, which was a surprise to all of the medical providers. And so everything lay dormant for several months. January 2021, my mom had a word that she had for a year. Each year she came up with a word. And it wasn't that she came up with a word. She would like meditate, and she would pray, and she would like see if what word would sort of come up for her as an important word of the year to focus on. And for 2021, her year, for the 2021 year, her word was courage. And she felt like that's what she really needed to focus on in 2021. She was hoping that cancer treatment would be over and that 2021 would be the year that everything would just shift and change, and she'd start to be able to heal and all of these things. We all were hoping and believing in that because we needed to. And it was in this time that she continued to do things that she was interested in. So she like engaged with friendships, and she had previously been an usher for different shows before all of the shows had shut down at the beginning of COVID. And so she had gotten involved with the arts, and she had started painting even through her chemo, and all these things that she wanted to do, she started to do really in 2020 and 2021, or she continued to do. She started doing like some of the arts type stuff and earlier than that, but she really started heightening some of those things in 2020 and 2021, and that was really important for her identity to be able to like get back to. She was an artist when she went to high school and college, and then ended up being a business school professor. So getting back to some of that was really important for her. And then we received news in May of 2021 that her cancer had come back, and she was going through the only option that was available. And this was kind of a rare thing for there to be a recurrence of pancreatic cancer. It's rare in general, as we had been told, for people to get diagnosed stage 1 with pancreatic cancer. But on top of that, then to have a recurrence, it was like we were in a whole new bracket of research and studies and low percentages of survival. So it really shifted our perspective then on like what it meant to connect with each other. And for my mom and I, it was really important. She had been having conversations already with, her own medical providers and therapists about like what her legacy would be, even through her cancer treatments. And so the word courage came up as she was talking about her legacy. And part of the legacy that I wanted to support her in her reflecting on it was our own relationship. And so she and I began to have these recorded conversations of graveyard, what we call graveyard conversations that I would have had with her at the graveyard, and conversations where we were just honest and frank with each other. And it was sort of like an ask me anything situation where we were just asking anything possible, from when I was young to now, and everything in between, things that were happy, things that were confusing, things that were sad, things in family history, ancestral knowledge, everything, wisdoms, things that my mom would have wanted us to experience or hear. I wanted to hear all her dreams just like articulated, and I wanted to give a platform for that. So we recorded these conversations together, and perhaps at some point I will share clips of that. But there were really beautiful wisdoms that came from those conversations, and also just a really transformational time for our relationship, where it was the relationship that it was almost the relationship I had always wanted with my mom, this vulnerability and this intimacy and this way to be able to be honest with each other while also speaking to each other as, yes, mother, daughter, but also kind of just adults in our life experience. And it was really beautiful. And so I think I learned in my grief that even then that I had the capacity to heal, that I was going to be able to heal. I couldn't see it in that moment. I didn't know what it would look like, but I think I had been storing up all of this anticipatory grief and trying to like grieve well and honor her legacy and honor her and honor our relationship so much that to make it easier after she wouldn't be here anymore. Well, November 2021 rolled around, and it was on November 20th that my mom left this earthly place and transitioned, and it felt really surreal. And so for anyone who's been in that situation or scenario of just everything just doesn't make sense, it's like a new schema or a new framework, like that was definitely, that's real. And that's what I felt for sure. And I think I was just at a complete loss, which loss describes that really well, but just loss of just what to feel and how to feel in so many different pieces. And I knew through that time that I really needed to experience just that grief that I was experiencing individually, like collectively with other people as well. I needed other people to also miss her and articulate that out loud. And it kind of came in the form of, I guess, our traditional like Western sense, where we have sort of a celebration of life or memorial or something to memorialize like the person we love who has transitioned. And that happened, and that was good and important for us to do together. And yet after that one-time event, I still felt like I was at a loss. I still felt like I needed some sort of collective processing of grief. And so after I buried my mom, in January 2022, I joined a gym. Like, I don't know why that's funny, but I joined a gym, I guess, like some people do. But I knew that in my past that the gym was important for me to have just a collective feeling of belonging to a place and getting embodied. And I didn't realize until I had been at the gym that through movement that I had become disembodied in my experience. I had intellectualized my grief, and I was just trying to get through, trying to be a strong support for my own mom, and then a support for my family, and then a support for myself, and a support for other people. And it was through being in a space where I could get really in my body and become embodied, really rooted in a community where I knew it could be potentially a safe space, that I could finally have my grief acknowledged and I could be held and shared in this like collective space. And no one had to necessarily come up to me and ask me about grief, even though I did want to talk about it. I talked about it every day, but it was just a space to be able to come back to myself. And then I realized through several different experiences that, I was in the desert for a wedding in Arizona, and I went to the Grand Canyon, and I just felt like no space, my little like space that I had been in, where I had been processing my home, where I was processing my grief, or even the gym where I was processing my grief. Everywhere I went, I was processing my grief in these contained spaces, and nothing felt big enough to hold it all until I went to the Grand Canyon. And when I went to the Grand Canyon, then I was like, wow, this place is big enough for me to process my grief. This place is big enough for me to really just was big enough to hold it all. And the terrain was just so different and varied, and the prickly cacti was exactly how I felt at certain times with different people's reaction to my grief, that my grief was inconvenient for them at times. And I just felt like the cactus really brought that to life. Or there are times where I was like walking and, I'd stumble with the rocks and the red dirt, and just realizing that there are all these cracks and crevices where my grief would seep into, but also it was not just surface. It was also very deep in these crevices of the canyon and in the small parts of the canyon. It was just everywhere. But the canyon and the desert allowed me to just like lay all my feelings there, unjudged and just ready to hold it all. In the hot of the sun and in the really, really cool evening, all of the temperature changes and all of the terrain changes, everything was just mirroring all the different pieces of my grief so much. And the birds that I saw that were flying away, and my desire to, somehow not have to experience the pain of grief while also feeling like the little chipmunks or ground squirrels that were there, that were just holding tightly to the things that they had. I saw myself reflected in the whole landscape. And so it was really beautiful. It was a moment where I was like, well, maybe there's more. Maybe there's more than a memorial service. Maybe there's more than these recordings. Maybe there is something to be learned out there in the world through other people's stories of how they process grief, but also how they begin to heal, for me to really learn for myself ways of honoring grief, my own grief, but also ways to learn about healing, and knowing that grief and healing are unique to each individual. I know that there are customs and rituals that maybe I wasn't familiar with that were important, and hearing from friends and other people who were willing to share their stories just made me feel so seen and so heard, and in ways that were just, I had never thought of, in ways to honor healing and honor grief. And so all of my identities that really interacted with those stories that I heard, the different pieces of my identity, which I haven't even fully named, but the different pieces as a Black woman who's a friend and a daughter and a sister and a wife and a therapist and a client and an athlete and a millennial, all those different pieces interacted with different people from different generations as I asked different people about their grief experiences. When I joined a grief group, really briefly, I was the youngest person in the grief group. And then later on joined a different grief group that was hosted by a friend at my gym. And in that grief group, I was able to see more people of color, people who look like me, who are also reflecting my age range a little bit more, and who are also identified as some of the similar identities, athlete and millennial or Gen X, and feeling like, oh, I'm not alone in this experience of a loss of a parent. And so my hope is that, well, before I go into my hope, what I realized about those identities, which I wanted to share, is that each of those identities shifted in ways that were either strengthened, supported, and prioritized. And other spaces, sometimes they weren't. And I realized in some of those relationships where those identities weren't prioritized or even spoken to or allowed space for, that, that it had less to do about me and had more to do with the other person's discomfort with grief. And what I realized is that not everyone has the capacity to or can walk with you effectively in your healing journey. But there are those people who do. So it was important for me to prioritize those relationships in my grief and healing process. And discernment was and still is the biggest lesson with healing for me. And I think that is a lesson that I hope that other people that resonates with other people, but also that maybe that's there are other lessons that you have probably learned that I would love to hear about too, as we have our shared grief and healing we're growing through. And so I think so many questions have come up, and some of the questions that have come up for me are like, how do you maintain that sense of grieving individually and collectively in a way where I can feel like my grief is important and understood, and that your grief is important and understood? And, I found that once, like in the ritual of a celebration of life, but I felt it more in the everyday interactions with people. And even in the grief groups that I attended sometimes, or in the conversations where people were willing to have a conversation with me about grief or about healing or about all my different identities that I have shifted and changed in different ways that have been prioritized now that my mom is here on this earth. So yeah, I think what if I ask this question I hope to ask more people, but I ask myself, what do I wish that people knew? Obviously, grief will change you. As I said, you're not alone in this, that you can grow through grief and you have the capacity to heal, but also that there's so much information out there. I texted, I called, I met up with friends, I sourced info from social media like a good millennial. And I think this podcast was born from that whole process. But to really find my niche or my place, I was really looking for that info on, people who sort of have had the shared experience and how their identities have shifted. I think that that's like the unique piece of really looking at grief is, how has my identity shifted as a daughter? How is my identity? Those are the questions I ask now. Or like, how does my identity shift and my intersectional identities? How does my identity shift as like a Black millennial woman who's an athlete? How does my identity shift as a Black woman who's a therapist? All of those pieces, I think I became a more effective therapist. I think I became, I challenged myself with new athletic feats and like competitions. And I think more of my story will unfold as I continue to interview other people and really share this space that I really want for people to be able to share their stories, and also to be able to maybe learn a little psychoeducational tip or a skill, or just something new about themselves, some sort of lesson learned. And I just want people to know that the questions that they have are not weird. They're very normal questions that come up with loss of just, when does the pain of grief ever stop, or does it stop? Will I ever feel joy again? And what are reminders knowing that, my person in my belief system is like in the spiritual world? What does that mean now? Do they show up? How do they show up? Are there reminders of them that like show up through like this spiritual interaction with our physical world, right? And there were so many answers and that I've been searching for. And so this podcast is a process of looking for those answers, but also really learning from different people's stories. And so I think if there's something that you get from today, hopefully it's that even though there are spaces out there, like I said, that might be not always like welcoming for your grief is welcome here. And your healing and where you're at is also welcomed here. And while this podcast is not therapy and doesn't constitute therapy, just knowing that you can have your story out there and listen to, and that we can also learn from you in it, is something that I hope for you. And so I'm hoping for this to be a safe and good way for you to share your grief. And so with that, I think that's probably a good place for me to end. But yeah, those are the different pieces of just my story and how I came to this idea of beginning this podcast. And I will grow through this process. And also, I am excited to hear from you all, as I hope to have more people on the show and hear your story that we want to honor, and we want to honor your people as well. And so with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you for listening today. And hopefully you too will go from feeling untethered in your feelings to feeling more rooted in your spirit and soul. And I wish you well. Thanks for listening to this episode of Untethered to Rooted. Untethered to Rooted is produced and hosted by me, Dana Daugherty. Original music was composed and performed by the ever-talented Daniel Dickinson. Thanks so much to our guests for sharing with us today. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And follow us on social at Untethered to Rooted. And if you didn't like it, what podcast? Dana who? Until next time, take and give good care.